Okay, so I want you to think about what just some things to think about from the readings and so far from what you've seen in the PowerPoint presentations and then the couple videos that you've already listened to from me. I want you to think about what are some of the messages so far that you've seen, that we've been hearing about women recreationally from ancient times through medieval times, European sort of Middle Ages and early modern influences. What trends were common, and how women recreated? What have you heard or what have you read about competition for women? Um, what do you notice about some of the obstacles that women faced in ancient times and medieval times, European 17th to 18th century, as we start to get ready to look at women's activities in America? What are some of those things that you are sort of recognizing and seeing and reading in the articles? Certainly, you should have read a couple of different introductory writings from books that are on women's sport history. I've never really been able to find one good text that's comprehensive that covers the course material like I kind of like it to flow. And so that's why you have a kind of a wide variety of excerpts and articles and different sources of reading materials, because I just have sort of picked and chosen from sources that have good parts but not wholly are great. And so I've never really found that one text yet that I love and sort of captures everything. So you should have read a couple of different introductions from books that are about women's sport history. One of them was a book that's written by Mariah Burton Nelson, and I actually have that excerpt sitting in front of me here. It is from the book Nike is a Greek Goddess. The introduction is written by her. Sorry, the whole book is a compilation. It's not just written by her, but the introduction is written by Mariah Burton Nelson, who does write pretty frequently about women's sports history. And there's a really nice part of her introduction that's really great, because I think if you think about the answers to those questions that I was just asking, messages about women recreationally from ancient times through medieval, early modern era, sort of the obstacles that women faced, what were some of these influences on how we see women today, even today, right? You're sort of going to recognize that there were lots of obstacles for women. They were tended to believe to sort of have only certain qualities that they could, in ways that they could behave physically, and sort of again, so then of course what that meant athletically and recreationally that they could do. There was sort of science behind opposing women doing things physical because it would harm them, keep them from having healthy babies, keep them from having children, like, conceiving. So there was all this, like, there's just so many things that were like preventing women from kind of pursuing what they wanted to. And what I love about what Mariah Burton Nelson writes is, I think, just really great, because it talks about how women athletes look at themselves, and I love this introduction that she writes, because it is right after talking about women boxers and women and strong women, and I love it too because it's a really interesting shift from the article on strong women that you read from Muscle and Fitness magazine. If you really took a good look at those pages of that article, you'll notice the advertisements. And there's an advertisement, if you look here, there's a copy of it. There's an advertisement for male muscle development, right? Or I'm sorry, actually, Arm Blaster, how men can develop their biceps, right? And then here on the opposing page is an advertisement for a woman's home gym equipment exercise machine equipment. Okay, so this one, Babe, BABE, B-A-B-E, build a body exerciser. That's what BABE stands for. And I don't know if you can see her, I don't know if you can see her pose, but please tell me you can see her pose. If you can't see her pose, you should check it out in your own article. And then here we go. Here's the male one. You see that? Do you see the difference? Okay, so in an article about strong women, here are the images that we got to see. And now this article was written in the 80s, okay? But please just take a note, okay? If you don't have some sort of internal conflict with what this is, what's going on here, then you're missing something. You're missing something, right? I mean, because even just looking at the stance of this woman, I mean, I don't exercise like that. I don't even get ready to exercise like that. If she's stretching, that's not even how I stretch, right? Pretty sure all the women that are taking this class probably feel the same way. Men, you probably haven't seen a whole lot of women in the gym that look like that when they're getting ready to work out. And most men we see don't look like this either. And maybe they aspire to some. But, you know, when we're talking about an article on strong women, and these are the two ads that we put amongst that article, it's just a very interesting sort of subliminal message that we're sending. And so I just like the timing of having read this article on Sisterhood of Strength, and then reading some of the different introductions, and having Mariah Burton, Nelson Burton's introduction. It's just perfect timing, okay? Because here is the excerpt I want to read. It's on page Roman numeral 10 and 11. The end of 10 and the beginning of 11. I'm going to read it to you, and you can go back and read it yourself, again, if you want to. But this is what she talks about, what sport does for women. Here's what she says. She says, female athletes repossess their bodies. Told that they're weak, they develop strength. Told that certain sports are wrong for them, they decide for themselves what's right. Told that their bodies are too dark, big, old, flabby, or wrinkly to be attractive to men, they look at naked women in locker rooms and discover for themselves the beauty of actual women's bodies in all their colors, shapes, and sizes. Told that certain sports make women look like men, quote unquote, they notice the truth. Working out doesn't make them look like men, it makes them look happy. It makes them smile. It makes them radiate health and power. It makes them feel good. Lunging for a soccer ball, women don't worry if their hair looks attractive. Leaping over a high bar, they do not wish they had bigger breasts. Strapped snugly into a race car, roaring around a track at 220 miles per hour, they do not smile and wave. While playing sports, women use their bodies to do as they please. If in that process, female bodies look unladylike, if they become bruised or bloody or simply unattractive, that seems irrelevant. Women own their bodies while running to catch a ball. They remember that. So this is a perfect little excerpt that helps us try to shift our mindset on how women have been perceived up to this point, from ancient times through medieval times, early modern era. And then as we get into how women started to recreate and physically participate in the United States of America. I know Mariah Burton Nelson goes on to talk about sort of feminism, and feminism being about freedom. And she just really wants to remind the readers that women, being athletic and being athletes gives women empowerment and helps women define themselves for themselves. And so you'll start to see how that really does transform and shape for women as we start to look at early influences on women's recreational and sporting habits in the United States, but then as it grows and develops through Olympic participation, the implementation of Title IX, the implementation of professional leagues and elite level sport opportunities for women. All of these things have shifted and changed how women are taken more seriously as athletes and how they are appreciated as athletes. So let's talk about what were some of the American precedents for women participating in sporting activity in the United States. And we certainly saw a lot of lawn games, croquet and tennis. These were two pretty popular activities for women in the sort of late 17th century, early 18th century. We saw croquet in the United States, particularly in the late 1860s, 60s, early 1870s. In Brooklyn is where we saw the first sort of influx of women playing the sport. It was taken up by more of like high society in the Brooklyn and New York area, but it started to gain just like general popularity throughout the United States. Shortly after that, it was quite popular with women, and it was one of the first games played in the United States by both sexes, which was to some degree controversial because it was, again, something that we didn't typically see women and men working or playing together. But what we started to see was that croquet became sort of like just a regular routine activity for people. It was like it was mandatory equipment in every estate. Civic leaders provided like public courses for people to participate, and facilities for them to, have their croquet experiences. And it was easy for women to play because they could still wear their sort of full garb. I mean, those images that you see on the PowerPoint, women are still wearing like the corset and the big skirts. And so you'll see that some of these activities that women were initially doing, these were acceptable activities for them because they could still wear their everyday attire. And so, it was pretty common to see women playing croquet. It became actually quite distasteful because what they started to see was sort of this philandering type of activity. People were starting to gamble. Because of the mixed gender of social interaction, it was starting becoming sort of a seedy activity. The mixed genders fraternizing with one another. It was just like, all of a sudden, the popularity of it sort of really started to wane. And also in the wake of that, I mean, part of that was because it was in the wake of lawn tennis coming to the United States. And as that popularity grew, the culture around croquet, and the enthusiasm around it began to wane. And so croquet kind of developed this unsavory reputation, because it was associated with gambling and drinking and, again, philandering, to such an extent that, so we started to see some civic leaders banning croquet. So at one point they were making it accessible and providing spaces where people could play croquet, and then we started to see them flipping sort of the script and banning it from their communities. And so they, sometimes calling it immoral, and this public leisure activity is something that we shouldn't see our citizens engaging in. And so what it was getting replaced by was something that was much more sort of pristine in the setting, which was lawn tennis. And so that really became, that sort of took over the popularity of croquet. And so while the croquet and sort of enthusiasts far outnumbered tennis players, we started to see that starting to shift when croquet took on this kind of unsavory reputation. Women first played lawn tennis, at Wimbledon in 1884, and so while there was sort of a history of women playing in Europe, we saw them playing on the large stage like Wimbledon and other like tournament competitions in the 1880s in Europe. Mary Outerbridge is the woman that is credited for bringing tennis to the United States. She actually had experienced it playing not in Europe, but in Bermuda. And so when she came back to Staten Island, where she lived, she helped set up the first tennis club that women participated in. And we saw in the 1880s a huge growth in women participating in tennis. And while at Wimbledon in 1884 was the first women's tournament, we saw in New York the first national tennis tournament here for women held in the late 1880s, 1887, 88. And again, like croquet, women could wear their everyday attire, their formal attire. And so this was one of the reasons why this sport was able to be pretty popular for women, because they could wear their typical like sort of clothing and garb. So croquet and tennis were sort of those sort of first two emerging sports, and then we started to continue to see these kind of more individual sports growing popularity. And the next individual sport we want to talk about is pedestrianism. Um, Pedestrianism has strong English roots. Americans were quick to import it because it was an individual activity. We saw it emerging in the late 1870s. We saw people promoting it, and gamblers participated in, betting on participants and who would win the different races of pedestrian races that happened. It was, you know, usually the pedestrian matches typically covered distances from anywhere from like a quarter mile to 30 miles, and they drew crowds like you wouldn't believe. I mean, sometimes there were 25,000 spectators along the race route. And so we saw like a really large following around pedestrianism, and part of it is because people felt like there was sort of an erotic sensationalism around it. I mean, these women actually didn't wear their corset and big dresses and bloomers underneath. They wore sort of shorter pants. They still wore sort of those like interesting like small heel boots to walk in, but they would have sort of their leggings or fishnet leggings or netting stockings on with some shorter pants and a sort of a loose top. And I think it was like very sensuous for people to watch, and it was like, you know, very interesting for people to watch women's bodies and see that much of their body in that sort of physical activity. Pedestrianism tended to be like a symbol of independent, heroic womanhood, and so we saw this growth of pedestrianism in the 1870s, like I said, and women started to like sort of cash in on this experience of pedestrianism. By, you know, hosting their own races, and again drawing these large crowds, and the promoters sort of talking about like, you know, gamblers making your bet. And so women were capitalizing on this situation because here we are, women making money, people making money off of women competing, and again, you know, it becoming something that was really popular. And really a lot of it had to do with the fact that it wasn't so much promoted as something as athletic as it was something more erotic. So people were coming to see, what is this pedestrianism all about? And if they wanted to go see someone really good at the skill of pedestrianism, they would want to go see Madame Ada Anderson. She's the most famous pedestrian walker. She walked, if you read the reading, you'll have read about her story. She walked 3,000 quarter miles and 3,000 quarter hours. During those 3,000 quarter hours, she never slept or rested more than 10 minutes at a time, because she would walk every quarter of the hour at the top of that quarter hour. And however long it took her to complete that time, to walk that quarter mile, she used the rest of the time to rest. Sometimes she would, she would obviously eat at sometimes, but it would take her, anywhere between 2:45, 3.5 minutes to walk that quarter mile. And it took her a month to complete the task. She walked her last quarter mile in 2 minutes and 38 seconds. And it became a huge spectator event. So for over a 1 month period, she never slept more than 10 or 15 minutes at a time. Or 10 minutes at a time, because at every quarter hour she got up and walked a quarter mile. And it was really amazing, but she profited about $10,000 from that one 3,000 mile expedition. And that was actually sort of something that spurred a lot of other women's pedestrian competitions throughout the year. No one ever did what she did. That was a feat that she only was able to achieve. But it spurred off these other competitions, about a year's worth of pedestrian competitions, that actually helped women compete and make money. And then, other people make money off of these women competing in the pedestrian activities. So on to some other individual sports. Archery. We saw in 1879, the late 1870s, the first women's archery championship. And it was a nationwide championship experience. It was hosted by the National Archery Association. Archery, again, considered ladylike because they could wear their normal attire. It was something that they did individually. It didn't require a lot of physical exertion, so it was a ladylike sport that they could participate in. And, it was a very acceptable event for women to participate. So was golf. I mean, golf, of course, like we talked about with Mary, Queen of Scots, she was an avid golfer, and so that was something that lended itself to women participating in golf across Europe, and then that influence certainly made its impact here in America for women. And it was, we saw the sort of first women's tournament, 7-hole tournament in Long Island, New York. And that was certainly an experience for women that they appreciated. Anytime that you had like competitions for women, it was so unique and such a novel experience that the women who got to participate in it were just thrilled, because they, that was something that was just so not, that was so out of the ordinary. And so we saw, we sort of saw that this sort of excitement around golf as an activity for women to participate in. So then I want to just shift quickly to one particular woman that is really important for you to know. Her name is Frances Willard. And she promoted bicycle riding for women. She wrote an instructional guide on how to teach yourself how to ride a bicycle. She wrote a book called A Wheel Within a Wheel, How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle. It was written in 1895, and it was written for women, to empower women on how to ride a bicycle. So what Frances Willard did was she taught herself how to ride a bike. She was 53 years old at the time. She spent 15 minutes a day for 3 months straight trying to figure out how to balance herself on this mechanism and teach herself how to ride a bike. And in doing that, she wrote a book that changed the way women think about athletic endeavors, and hers was specifically around riding a bike. And you probably are wondering, or many people ask, like, why the bicycle? Why would Frances Willard pick the bicycle? Well, riding a bicycle gave women independence. It gave them freedom. By 1896, so a year after she released this book was released, women were buying 30% of all new bicycles. By the turn of the century, women were buying at least half the bicycles purchased. And so she really made it very popular for women to want to learn how to ride the bicycle, to have that independence to go where they wanted to, when they wanted to go, to make their decisions on where the bike would take them. And so it was a very liberating experience. There's a couple of quotes from her book that I think are really great. I'm going to read a couple of them for you. So the first one is from the book, and Frances Willard writes, "That which made me succeed with the bicycle was precisely what had gained me a measure of success in life. It was the hardihood of spirit that led me to begin, the persistence of will that held me to my task, and the patience that was willing to begin again when the last stroke had failed. And so I had found high moral uses in the bicycle, and could commend it as a teacher without pulpit or creed." So she's talking about hardihood of spirit, the persistence, and the patience that it took for her to learn how to ride the bicycle. So a really, if you think about sports and the participation that you've had in sports and what it means to you and the intangibles that you learn from participating in sports, I'm sure that you can understand where Frances Willard is coming from, and that's the type of thing that she talked about. And she really helped make bicycling a very popular sport by the end of the 19th century. The safety bicycle, which is what we know today as the bicycle with the two same-sized wheels, when in 1890, the pneumatic tires were developed. bicycling became just like, it totally exploded. And of course, because women were really empowered to also um, learn how to ride the bike, we saw over 1 million women owning bicycles by the year by 1895, 1896. So it was really exciting. And I think that this is something that people don't tend to know and realize a lot about, but Frances Willard was known to be someone who really influenced an independent thought and ability for women. Um, there's another quote here I want to read quick. She says, "Two things must occupy your thinking powers to the exclusion of every other thing. First, the goal, and second, the momentum requisite to reach it. Do not look down like an imbecile. Look up and off and on and out. Get forehead and foot in line, the latter acting as a rhythmic spur in the flanks of your equilibrated equine. So shall you win, and that right speedily." Talking about how just get on that bike, look up, look out, be confident, and learn how to, and just get yourself on that bike and learn how to ride it. I think it's really great. So the influence of what Frances Willard did in terms of independence for women was really felt. It also sort of spawned or created a fashion revolution, because Amelia Bloomer, who designed bloomers, who created bloomers, was a designer that created bloomers, the bloomers that were worn underneath the big dresses, is what women tended to wear when they were riding their bicycle, because it was obviously more comfortable, and obviously made it much easier for women to ride their bicycles comfortably and safely. But what happened is when women were riding their bicycles, they got off their bicycles and they didn't put their dresses back on, they didn't put their skirts back on, and so they were wearing their bloomers in regular everyday activity. And so it actually, the bicycle, learning how to ride the bicycle, and so many women learning how to ride the bicycle, actually spurred a sort of fashion revolution in women wearing bloomers more regularly as just like everyday clothing. So women, they left aside the full skirts, the petticoats, the corsets, and they went for the bloomers. And so no doubt this liberated women. This was a liberation to women as well. The bicycle was so much of a liberating thing that Susan B. Anthony, right, one of the most well-known social reformers and feminists who led the suffragette movement, said that the bicycle did more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. I mean, that is how impactful Susan B. Anthony saw the bicycle for women. It was a symbol of freedom, independence, adventure, and of course, because it spawned a fashion revolution too, it had that much of an influence as well on women. Okay, so a couple more things we're going to go through here really, not really quick, but relatively. Eleanor Sears, sort of the first multi-talented athlete. Over her lifespan, she won 240 trophies over a wide variety of sports. She was a marathon walker, a swimmer. She showed horses. She played polo, tennis, squash, baseball, field hockey. I mean, that list on your slideshow is like very, very inclusive and conclusive. She raced cars, flew planes, she sailed yachts, she raced powerboats. She was probably most well known for squash. She started the United States Women's Squash Association. She was the captain of that organization, and she won the most amount of like individual titles during the era when she competed. So she's probably most well known for her squash abilities and her ability on the squash court, and then tennis as well, because she won multiple championships as a tennis singles player and doubles player. But like I said, 240 trophies over her lifetime over these wide variety of different sports that she participated in. So Eleanor Sears is a really remarkable woman, kind of first talented athlete that is definitely worth knowing and realizing the depth and the breadth of her abilities. Another sort of woman to know writer, Catherine Beecher. She wrote the Physiology and Calisthenics for Schools and Families. This was a book on calisthenics. She herself was a physical education teacher. She believed that every every strong household and happy household had to have a strong woman that was overseeing it. So she was, she was someone who really advocated for women being physically active. Calisthenics seemed to be a pretty good route to go because every woman could do it. It was more so these little slow, deliberate movements. But much like Dame Juliana Berners, who wrote the treatise on fishing and hawking and hunting, this was a how-to instructional book, and this was not common for women to write. So Catherine Beecher, while coming from a family of sort of revolutionary thinkers, I mean, her father was an abolitionist preacher. Her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So if you sort of, know anything about that, you understand that this family was sort of a revolutionary thinkers. And so Catherine Beecher too was thinking, like, how do I promote women and support this notion that they should be strong, confident women. And so she wrote this instructional book. Again, pretty novel concept for having a woman write an instructional book. And within that too, she talked about sort of healthy diets and how women should remain active in order to keep and maintain the home. So still thinking about the woman in the domestic role, but how we also expand her domestic responsibilities into physical exercise so that she can stay healthy and maintain a healthy home. So Catherine Beecher, another good woman to know. It's kind of neat to see some of the images, the diagrams in the book that she wrote. And important to know that she was a physical education teacher because these existed. We know they existed particularly at the higher levels of education, and we look to some of the women's colleges out east as the model example of women's college physical education programming. Vassar College and Wellesley College were two of the most prominent and well-known programs of higher learning that implemented physical education as part of their educational curriculum. And so we see sort of the start of women, of people understanding that part of women's educational development has to do with their physical well-being as well. So health and physical education as well as academic, intellectual education. So Vassar College, Wellesley College, they're amongst two of the first all-women's schools at the time, and all-women's schools that brought about physical education as a part of the academic curriculum for women. And we also saw team sports developing at those institutions. One really notable team sport that developed in this era in the sort of late 1800s, right, the 1870s and 80s is when we started to see these programs popping up, was basketball at Smith College. And the mother of women's basketball, who was Senda Berenson. She was a physical education teacher who took James Naismith's version of basketball that was created in 1892, and she took it and developed her own version of it. And so what she did was she created essentially a version of basketball where you didn't cover the entire court. You stayed in one section of it. So you're either a defender, you were a middle rover, or you were an offensive player. And there were 3 from each team in each of those sections. So essentially it was 3, 6, 9 on 9. 3 defenders against 3 offensive players. 3 middle players were roamers against 3 other middle roamers from the other team, and then 3 offensive players against the 3 defensive players from the opponent's teams. They weren't allowed to dribble more than a couple dribbles. They had to obviously stay in their portion of the court, so they had to move the ball up the court through passing, which is obviously normal and fine. But she wanted to create the opportunity for women to play this game, but modified the rules so that it didn't startle people that she wanted women to play this men's game. And so she was able to create rules that made it felt acceptable to people that women could play the sport of basketball. Basketball spread from across the country, and we actually see the first like documented game of two teams against one another in a game that was played between Stanford and Cal Berkeley. The final score was 2-1. Um, it was really obviously like a heated contest. I mean, 2-1. This was a barn burner, people. Um, and there was about 500 spectators there. Pretty much what they believed was all female spectators, because the women didn't want to allow men to observe them playing in this kind of competition. And it was a very social environment. I mean, it was like, come, let's play this sport with each other, but then let's afterwards get together and have maybe like eat something, have a meal, have a social time. So it was really something much more social than it was sort of fierce competition. But what we saw from this development of basketball, thanks to Senda Berenson, who developed it, what we saw was this explosion of team sports coming into play post 1880 in the United States. Lacrosse, while it was originated with Native Americans, it was first developed as a women's game in 1886, and we saw it have its sort of its women's development in 1886 in the United States of America. So lacrosse was one team sport. Softball was another one. Softball originated as an indoor game in Chicago. It was actually invented by a man named James Hancock on Thanksgiving in 1887, but it became what we know of today as an outdoor sport, mostly primarily played by women. That was another team sport that really started to catch on for women to participate in. Basketball, like we talked about, invented by Naismith in 1891, and then Senda modified the rules in 1892 for women, and so it became a very popular women's team sport. Volleyball was developed by a man named William Morgan. He was an instructor at the YMCA. He saw James Naismith develop this sport called basketball, and he came up with the idea of volleyball, which is the net across the court and people volleying the ball back and forth to one another. It's actually originally called Mintonette was actually the original name of it, Mintonette. But when people were watching it, spectating it, they're like, oh, it's really neat how they're volleying this ball back and forth. And so they actually changed the name of the sport to volleyball. It was meant to be a sport that kind of combined tennis and handball, basketball, baseball. It was sort of meant to be kind of a combination, blend all the elements of those sports. And have no contact. And so that was the idea behind this sport. And one of the reasons why Morgan didn't want to have contact was because he was thinking of businessmen coming to play this sport, and they could play in their suits and not have to worry about, coming into contact and having all that physical like disruption with other people around them or their opponents that they're playing against. So this is what made it a little bit different from lacrosse and basketball. That were already pretty popular at the time. And then field hockey, while having a really solid foundation in Europe, and the first club for women having been established in 1887, hadn't really taken a hold in the United States until a little after 1900, about 1902, when Constance Appleby came to the United States and introduced field hockey to people in the U.S. And so it was pretty while it was really popular in Europe, it didn't quite catch on in terms of popularity here with the growth of lacrosse and softball, basketball, volleyball for women, but it still had its influence in America as a team sport that women got organized to play in. So the last thing I want to talk about are organizations that really helped promote women in athletic endeavors. The YMCA and the YWCA, the Young Men's Women's Christian Association, sort of established this ability for women to participate in sporting activities. So the opportunity to empower women to participate athletically in activities was what the YWCA had been organized and created for. But other organizations that were maybe a little more successful and also thought about youth level and have since then become sort of a mainstay in terms of youth development and sport opportunities and competitions at a national level are the Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, which was established in 1888, and then the National Association for Girls and Women in Sport in 1899. Probably a lot of you have association with AAU. You either played in AAU or have friends or family members that played AAU. It's one of the largest nonprofit volunteer sport organizations in the United States. It was established to create uniformity in youth sports and produce opportunities for amateur athletes to compete nationwide, to have nationwide competition opportunities. And today, I mean, the reason I said probably you either participated or you know someone who did it. I mean, like 500,000 kids across the United States between 9 and 18 participate in AAU programming, and they have over 50,000 volunteers. So, there was certainly lots of opportunities created initially for boys, but then women. The first organized competition for women was fencing, which is interesting. But actually, did they not only hold competition for women to participate in fencing, but they also then created these opportunities for women to go across the country and do demonstrations and teach people how to fence. So AAU not so much does that anymore, but initially helped promote the growth of different athletic endeavors. The National Association of Girls and Women in Sport, they also held championships for women, or for girls and for women, and a variety of opportunities. They sort of strive to be one of the premier organizations that are dedicated to advocacy, education, and athletic opportunities for girls and women in sport. It definitely tries to promote a healthy, active lifestyle for women. And today focuses a little bit more on educational programming and developing strong female leaders, but certainly is a well-known, established organization that does empower women in a variety of ways. So you probably are familiar with some other, organizations too that promote youth sports, but these are the ones that I think are most important for you to know. And because they have a longer, history of establishment and really did help promote girls and women in their athletic endeavors and competitive athletic endeavors, which was what we liked to see and was a huge shift for women in the United States around the 1900s. But we started to see women getting the opportunity to compete in sport, not just participate and do it recreationally, but to compete, and sometimes compete at a national level. So it's a really lots of information for you for early American precedents and women's activity, recreational activity. And so I hope that you really take advantage of reading those introductions on sort of women's history of established sporting activity in the United States, and then because I do think that helps set you off for the weeks to come in terms of how we learn about how women's sports continue to grow and develop in the United States. So once you've listened to both of the lectures and you've reviewed your materials, make sure you take a moment to take your quiz. I think that you will find it's not as daunting as it might seem. It is a lot of information, but hopefully you'll find that it's the most sort of prominent information that you need, or just information you need to know out of the materials that you've read and listened to over the first 2 weeks of class. So good luck on your quiz, and we'll see you next week when we talk about Title IX.